Okay. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 4, the chair may postpone further proceedings on approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider 11 bipartisan measures and a number of amendments en bloc. Pursuant to notice for purposes of markup, I now call up the en bloc package consisting of 11 measures, which are H.Res. 512, calling for the global repeal of blasphemy, heresy, and apostasy laws with 11 amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 5408, Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act, with a Wilson Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.Res. 742, recognizing the continued success of the Food for Peace Act, with an Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 5664, LIFT Act, with a McCall Amendment. H.Res. 720, expressing the sense of the House of Representatives that the International Olympic Committee should correct Jim Thorpe's Olympic records for his unprecedented accomplishments during the 1912 Olympic Games. H.R. 2166, Global Health Security Act, with a Connolly Amendment in the nature of a substitute and a Houlihan Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 2847, No Passport Fees for Heroes, Families Act, with a Wilson Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.Res. 723, encouraging all nations to end sexual violence against girls through in-country data-driven reforms as demonstrated by multiple African nations, with a Wild Amendment in the nature of a substitute and a Houlihan Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.Res. 809, expressing the importance of the United States alliance with the Republic of Korea and the contributions of Korean Americans in the United States, with an Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.Res. 458, reaffirming the strong partnership between Tunisia and the United States and supporting the people of Tunisia in their continued pursuit of democratic reforms, with a Deutsch Amendment in the nature of a substitute. H.R. 1611, Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act, with a Deutsch Amendment in the nature of a substitute. At this time, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. I'm pleased to support all of the bipartisan measures before us today, and I thank our members for their hard work. I'll keep my remarks brief and highlight just a few of the 11 bills and resolutions. First, I'll start with Mr. Connolly's Global Health Security Act. We can see clearly right now just how important it is to invest in smart, effective global health policy. Pandemics like coronavirus don't stop at borders, so it's critical that our government effectively coordinates the response to outbreaks here and abroad. We used to have a key coordinating body in the White House charged with that task. Under the Obama administration, these experts directed our responses to the Ebola and Zika outbreaks. Their work showed just how important it is to invest in preparedness, to build up our capacity, to respond quickly so we can prevent an outbreak from snowballing into a bigger crisis. Unfortunately, this administration dismantled that coordinating group, so I'm pleased that Mr. Connolly's measure will get those best practices back up and running, requiring a global health security coordinator to manage our response in emergencies like this and help us prepare rather than just react. It's a good bill I strongly support. Next, I'll turn to the Leveraging Information on Foreign Traffickers Act, or the LIFT Act, a bill authorized by Mr. McCall. I was pleased to join the ranking member in introducing this good measure to ensure that the State Department has the right tools to combat human trafficking, a heinous crime that has ensnared over 25 million people around the world. I'm also proud of the work that this committee has done on this matter, and I especially want to thank Mr. Smith for his leadership on this issue for over 2 decades. Today's measure continues that legacy for our committee. The LIFT Act enhances the State Department's ability to gather information on this horrendous practice and engages survivors in our policymaking process. We must continue to fight modern-day slavery and work to enact legislation that brings us to a brighter future, free of this horrific injustice. Today's measure is a step in that direction, and I hope all of my colleagues will join me in supporting it. Next, I'll turn to Mr. Deutsch's Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery Act, named for one of the many Americans being unjustly held captive abroad. It's critical that our government take every step possible to get our citizens home safely. President Obama made important policy changes on this matter, creating a special envoy position to be the point person on these efforts and providing transparent, open lines of communication with the family members of these American hostages. The Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery Act puts those initiatives into law, building toward a more thorough and effective approach to helping these people and their families. It's a good bill I'm pleased to support. I also want to recognize two family members of Americans being held in Iran here with us today, Sarah Moriarty and Babak Namazi. Thank you for your dedication and strength. Next, I want to address House Resolution 809 from Mr. Swazi, reaffirming the United States' commitment to our alliance with the Republic of Korea. At a time when we face an increasingly aggressive China, a dangerously unhinged North Korea, and a host of other challenges, including the coronavirus outbreak, it is imperative that we stay in lockstep with our partners in the region. Right now, the Trump administration is working on finalizing a cost-sharing agreement with South Korea regarding our forces on the Korean Peninsula. The Trump administration started out by asking our allies to pay 400% more than they did before. While it is important for our partners to shoulder more of the burden over time, it is important that the final agreement reflects our close partnership with the Republic of Korea and advances our shared goal of preserving security and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific. I support this measure and urge all of our members to do the same. Finally, I'll say a few words about House Resolution 512 from Mr. Raskin. Freedom of religion is a fundamental human right. No one should face oppression because of their religious beliefs or lack thereof. It's hard to stomach that today in 2020 there are still more than 70 countries with criminal blasphemy laws on the books that target people for their faith. Today's resolution calls for repeal of these dangerous laws. I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting it. I strongly support all the measures we are considering today, and I urge all members to join me and do the same. And I'll now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your cooperation and leadership on these 11 measures. As you know, our committee has its greatest impact when we operate on a bipartisan basis, as we are doing so today. Let me start by thanking the chairman for working with me on the Leveraging Information on Foreign Traffickers, or LIFT Act, which continues this committee's 20-year tradition of bipartisan work to combat the scourge of human trafficking, which affects greatly our nation and my home state of Texas. U.S. law currently requires the State Department to deny U.S. visas to human traffickers. But when the department denies visas to traffickers, it does not tell its own anti-trafficking officials where and how often those denials occur. This bill ensures that appropriate State Department officials leading the fight receive this important information on a timely basis. Modern slavery affects millions around the world, but it is not just a problem in the developing world. It is happening right now in our backyards, in our neighborhoods. A month ago, I was proud to stand with my inspiring constituent, Courtney Litvak, at the White House Human Trafficking Summit. We need to keep the voices of survivors at the center of the policy conversation. And for that reason, this bill also reauthorizes the survivor-led U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking through 2025. My amendment also makes sure that survivors who otherwise couldn't afford to take time off from work are able to serve on this council, such as Courtney Litvak. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent also to place into the record a letter of support for the LIFT Act from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And I want to thank you again for joining me on this important bill. I hope we can move it quickly to the floor. As we face the growing challenges of the novel coronavirus, I also want to commend Mr. Connolly and Mr. Shabbat for their Global Health Security Act. This bill will help ensure that our interagency and international efforts to address global health emergencies are as coordinated and efficient as possible. And I also want to thank Mr. Wilson for his Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act. When deciding whether to designate Russia as a country of particular concern for religious freedom violations, U.S. officials must also consider Russia's persecution of religious groups inside those areas of Ukraine that it occupies or controls. And finally, I also support the No Passport Fees for Heroes Families Act. In cases where our service members are severely wounded abroad, this bill waives passport fees for family members traveling to assist in their recovery. So I'm very glad, Mr. Chairman, once again, we worked on both sides of the aisle to get this work done. I hope the remainder of this Congress will be as cooperative as the first markup of this year. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. McCall. Does anyone seek recognition for the purpose of speaking on the en bloc package? I now recognize Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I am, of course, in favor of the en bloc approval of these bills. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your support, in particular of the Global Health Security Act. And I also want to thank the ranking member and his staff for working with us to make this happen. I also want to thank my partner in crime, Steve Shabbat, who's been a wonderful partner in so many enterprises, including this one. We have a number of Democratic and Republican co-sponsors. I also want to congratulate and thank Ms. Houlihan for her thoughtful amendment that I think adds clarity to this bill. We're in the midst of what may very well turn out to be a pandemic, the coronavirus. It's running at a lethality rate that's 20 times that rate of normal flu. We've already had 9 deaths here in the United States. We have no vaccine against this virus, and even our best medical interventions are not 100% efficacious. And we have to be prepared. 2 years ago, the administration dismantled the apparatus that had been put in place 5 years before in the face of the Ebola crisis. I think, in retrospect, that was an unwise move. This bill would restore that and institutionalize it. This is not a criticism about this president or this administration. It is a recognition, however, that just as happened 5 years ago, we didn't have the apparatus in place, which is why an Ebola czar had to be named. We can't go from pandemic to pandemic. We know throughout human history, pandemics are going to be part of our history. We need to be prepared. We need to have a locus in the National Security Council in the White House that is charged with that responsibility, monitoring, intervention, collaboration, networking, and of course taking measures to protect the American people in the event of a possible pandemic. It shouldn't take a crisis for us to act. And the American people, I think, do expect us to act. And I think this gives us an opportunity as a committee to make our contribution, and it will be a substantive contribution. I'm very pleased that the Global Health Security Act is endorsed by the Child Fund International, Global Health Council, the International Medical Corps, the InterHealth International, Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, Nuclear Threat Initiative, PATH, the American Society of the Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, Management Sciences for Health, the Sabin Vaccine Institute, the Borgen Project, and the American Society for Microbiology. I think we can move this bill, and I hope we will bring it to the floor swiftly on suspension so that we can get this, this institutionalized structure in place so that never again do we have to move from crisis to crisis. Again, I thank my colleagues for their bipartisan support, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? I now recognize Mr. Chabot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move the strike last word. We have a number of very good bills before us this morning, but I want to focus on H.R. 2166, the Global Health Security Act, bipartisan legislation that my Democratic colleague and friend, Jerry Connolly, who has just spoken, and I introduced at the beginning of last year to strengthen U.S. and global preparedness for and capacity to respond to pandemics, or what may be a pandemic like the coronavirus. With coronavirus spreading across the globe, our consideration of this legislation is timely, and our decision to introduce the legislation in the first place over a year ago was prescient. Over 90,000 cases have been confirmed worldwide, with over 100 in the United States at this time. As this is proving once again, diseases don't know borders, and a deadly virus is just a plane ride away. That's why the United States must continue to lead the world's efforts to advance global health security. This act has two main goals. First, it codifies our commitment made by both the Obama and Trump administrations to the global health security agenda, a multilateral partnership that aims to strengthen health systems and laboratories in countries around the world so that they might meet the international health regulation standards. Folks back home might wonder why we should bother about other countries' health systems, but as coronavirus shows, a weak health system in another country, in this instance China, can directly threaten us here in America. Second, our bill makes sure that we have the personnel the personnel is in place to prepare for when the need arises to respond to pandemics like the coronavirus. Specifically, we need someone, preferably at the NSC, to quarterback the U.S. government's response, since that response inevitably involves several agencies across the government, from the State Department to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. Several Republicans, including then-Chairman Ed Royce, called for the appointment of a single point person with a health background during the Ebola outbreak back in 2014. The Obama administration got it half right with the appointment of a political appointee as the singular lead. It seems that the Trump administration has now followed a similar course to what Republicans wanted in 2014 with an appointment of Ambassador Debbie Birx, a universally respected health expert, as White House coronavirus response coordinator under Vice President Pence. In any event, our bill would make this position permanent so that when the next pandemic comes, and we know it will eventually come, we are ready to go. As coronavirus continues to sweep the globe, we need to take this opportunity to recommit this nation to leadership on health security and prepare ourselves for the next pandemic. Protecting our nation's health must be a national security priority. Now is not the time to politicize this issue. The Global Health Security Act provides a bipartisan endorsement for this critical priority and elevates it within the U.S. government. Today's passage of our legislation will help America and the world for the next outbreak. So I would urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I again want to thank Mr. Connolly.
Would my friend yield just for a second?
I'd be happy to yield.
I am remiss in praising members. I also want to praise our staff on both sides of the aisle for making this happen, and particularly my staff member, Molly Cole, for shepherding this bill to this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I have to thank Mark Erst, my staffer who principally worked on this, who's sitting behind me. We appreciate his work and all the work, as well as Mr. Engel and Mr. McCall also, who both supported this. We appreciate it. With that, I'd urge my colleagues to support the bill and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Sherman.
I commend the leadership of the committee and the staff for putting together 11 excellent bipartisan bills for the markup today. I first want to commend Jim Costa for his bill recognizing the continued success of the Food for Peace Act, and I want to congratulate Jim, who's not here, because he just had a very tough race in California, which he won by a very nice margin, and I look forward, and I think we all look forward to serving with Jim for many years to come. I want to commend Jamie Raskin for his work on condemning laws against blasphemy, heresy, and apostasy. And in our hearings in the Asia Subcommittee on Pakistan, we saw how these laws can be used to just make something up about a neighbor and lead to capital charges being filed and people coming even close to execution. I want to commend Tom Swazi for his bill recognizing the U.S. Republic of Korea alliance. The chairman and ranking member should be commended for their bill dealing with the traffic in persons report, and make sure that the information from that report is used effectively. Commend Susan Wild for her bill to focus our attention on ending sexual violence against girls. Jerry Conley for his bill on global health security, and there isn't a more important time for that than right now. Deb Haaland for her bill recognizing Jim Thorpe. Ted Deutsch's bill on our partnership with Tunisia. Paul Mitchell, I think, found a good point. We shouldn't be charging passport fees for visiting our heroes. And finally, I have, like all these bills, co-sponsored Joe Wilson's bill on Ukraine religious freedom. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Elliott Engel and Republican leader Michael McCall, for bringing these important bipartisan measures before us today. I'm grateful to recognize the leadership of Chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee, Ted Deutsch. I was glad to support and work with him on two important bills before us today, H.R. 1611 and H.Res. 458. Chairman Ted Deutsch has a long history of advocating for Americans wrongfully detained abroad, including his constituent, Robert Levinson, who disappeared in Iran 13 years ago this month. H.R. 1611, the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act, will go a long way toward ensuring the United States does all it can to fulfill and bring home Americans wrongfully detained abroad back home. The bill will set up a special presidential envoy for hostage affairs as well as a hostage recovery fusion cell to facilitate efforts to return these Americans back to their families. Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for your steadfast commitment to this issue, and I'm grateful to work with you on this important initiative. Additionally, I support Chairman Deutsch's House Res. 458, reaffirming the strong partnership between Tunisia and the United States and supporting the people of Tunisia in their continued pursuit of democratic reforms. I had the opportunity to travel to Tunisia this past September with the Helsinki Commission and see this budding democracy up close as parliamentary elections were taking place across the country. I am deeply impressed by the extraordinary people of Tunisia and their commitment to the democratic institutions of their country, which I saw firsthand of this vibrant democracy. They stand as a hope for the entire region, and I appreciate working with Chairman Deutsch on this resolution. I'm also grateful to be an original co-sponsor with Congressman Paul Mitchell's H.R. 2847, the No Passport Fees for Heroes Families Act. This bill should be supported by every one of our committee's members here today. It waives passport fees for family members of U.S. Armed Forces traveling abroad to visit their enlisted loved ones in the hospital. This is a very basic respect of our grateful nation that we can give to these families who put everything on the line for our country's and family's safety. Lastly, I'd like to thank Chairman Engel and Republican Leader McCall for marking up my bill, H.R. 5408, the Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act. Since its illegal invasion and occupation of Crimea and parts of the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine in 2014, killing over 13,000 Ukrainians, Russia has perpetrated egregious violations of religious freedom in those territories. This included imprisonment, torture, forced psychiatric hospitalizations, and more, again, with 13,000 citizens dead. Under binding laws of armed conflict, including the Geneva Conventions, the Russian Federation is responsible for religious freedom violations in territory it occupies or otherwise control. This bill will give the President the ability to take into consideration Russia's violations of religious freedom, not just within the Russian Federation, but also within the territory of Ukraine that Russia occupies or controls through armed groups it directs. When determining whether to designate Russia as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. Marking up this bill today sends a strong and clear message to Moscow. The United States will hold you accountable for your violations of human rights and religious freedoms in Ukraine. We will continue standing side by side with the brave people of Ukraine and freedom-loving people everywhere against the tyranny and evil perpetuated by the Kremlin. Additionally, I'd like to join in the praise of the bill by Congressman Swazi of our relationship and alliance with the Republic of Korea. What a dynamic country, what a symbol it is throughout Asia of the success of free market democracy. Thank you again for the Chairman and Republican leader. I encourage all my colleagues to support these bipartisan bills today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I thank the gentleman. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member for holding today's markup and for so many good measures that I am proud to support, especially given what we're facing globally, the Global Health Security Act. I want to thank you as well for including two of my bills, H.Res. 458 and H.R. 1611. And I want to thank Joe Wilson, the ranking member of the Middle East North Africa Subcommittee, for being such a strong leader and partner in these efforts and so many others. I was honored to introduce H.Res. 458, a resolution reaffirming the strong partnership between Tunisia and the United States, and express the support for the people of Tunisia in their continued pursuit of democratic reforms. I'm a strong supporter of the U.S.-Tunisia partnership. Of all the Arab states touched by revolution since 2010, Tunisia has emerged as the most stable and democratic, and I would like to congratulate the Tunisian people on the success of their recent elections. Tunisia continues to face many challenges, including the security threats posed by both extremists and the conflict in Libya, high inflation and high unemployment, especially among young Tunisians, and the need to develop inclusive and transparent and responsive political institutions. Congress will remain a committed partner to Tunisia as it confronts and overcomes these challenges and continues down the democratic path. Mr. Chairman, next week, March 9th, marks 13 years since the disappearance of my constituent, Bob Levinson. Bob disappeared from Iran's Kish Island. Most of you know Bob's story, if for no other reason than you've heard me tell it many times. Bob spent 25 years serving his country with the FBI. For the 10 years that I have been a member of Congress, I've urged every U.S. government official I meet to help bring Bob home. I've raised Bob's case with allies and partners in capitals around the world, and those efforts pale in comparison to the 13 years that the Levinson family has spent tirelessly advocating for Bob's release. For 13 years, this family, led by Bob's incredible wife, Christine, and his 7 children, Susan, Stephanie, Samantha, Dan, David, Doug, and Sarah, who's on the Hill this week, meeting with many of you, they've traveled to Washington hundreds of times. In the early days of Bob's disappearance, Christine and Dan traveled to Iran on their own to try to find answers. They've met with presidents and secretaries of state, officials at the United Nations. They are not public officials, professional lobbyists, or media strategists. They are just a family figuring out how to get the world to help them get their husband and father back. The Levinsons are far from the family that found themselves, the only family that's found themselves facing the daunting task of advocating for a loved one. Babak Namazi is on the Hill today. His father Bakr and his brother Siamak are still unjustly held in Iran. Babak, too, spends his time and energy advocating for his family's release, including this week as he desperately tries to get his family released from Evin prison, where the coronavirus is spreading rapidly. Today, we have the opportunity to help these families as they go through one of the most challenging and painful experiences imaginable. No family should be faced with the overwhelming task of navigating government bureaucracy and deciphering mixed messages from their own government. H.R. 1611, the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act, will create a support structure within the U.S. government for hostages and unlawful or wrongfully detained Americans. The bill will formalize the 2015 executive order issued in the aftermath of the tragic deaths of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff by ISIS terrorists, which created an interagency response structure at both the operational and the policy level. And I'd like to acknowledge the James Foley Foundation's work and its president and founder, Diane Foley, as well as Arthur and Shirley Sotloff for their continued work in pushing forward this important effort. The bill mandates the position of Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs at the State Department and requires families be given guidance on how to manage their interactions with the U.S. government. The bill will also formalize consistent family engagement. And finally, the bill provides the authority to sanction those who are responsible for or who assist in the unlawful detention of Americans, because we will not and cannot tolerate rogue regimes or actors that engage in hostage-taking. Passing this bill won't provide relief to the Levinsons or the other families suffering without their loved ones. But by passing this bill today, we can at least give these families one less thing to worry about. No family should have to face this situation without the proper resources and support from their own government. And today we can also take steps to hold those responsible for the unlawful detention of Americans accountable. Next week, Christine Levinson will mark 13 years without her husband. Bob's children will mark 13 without their dad. 13 years is too long. I hope this is the last time that this committee hears me tell Bob's story. And I'm grateful, so grateful, to all of my colleagues who have supported the Levinsons and all of the other families. And I urge your support for the Levinson Act today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for the opportunity to speak before the committee this morning. There's often quite a bit of partisan rancor in these settings, but I'm happy to witness a lot less of that today. Almost all of the pieces of legislation before us represent Congress at its best, working together in the interest of the American people and leading the way on critically important issues facing the world today. These bills accomplish a variety of essential policy goals, goals that reflect our values as a nation. They take a stand against the violation of religious freedoms. They ensure we are better prepared to eliminate the scourge of human trafficking off the face of the earth, and they provide succor to families visiting their wounded service members overseas. They reaffirm the intrinsic worth and dignity of every human life by confronting the evil practice of female genital mutilation. They reaffirm long-lasting partnerships with key allies, particularly South Korea, and they guarantee that those foreign actors who would take American citizens hostage will be forced to pay for their crime. These bills, several of which I've co-sponsored, demonstrate that Congress still has the capacity to set aside partisan differences and work together on measures all Americans can be proud of. The LIFT Act, offered by the ranking member, improves the State Department's preparation of the Trafficking in Persons, or TIP, report and extends the survivor-led U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking through 2025. The Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act ensures that we hit back against a tyrannical Russian regime that regularly violates the human rights of religious institutions in Russia-occupied Ukrainian territory stolen from Ukraine following the invasion of Crimea in 2014. I was also proud to co-sponsor H.R. 2847, which eliminates passport fees for family members visiting military service members in overseas military medical facilities. The Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act authorizes the President to establish an interagency framework aimed not only at ensuring that those Americans unjustly imprisoned overseas are released, but that the offending party is punished accordingly. House Resolution 809 focuses on the strategic importance of the U.S.-South Korea alliance and emphasizes just how much our partnership contributes to the cause of peace. It further highlights our nation's commitment towards the mutual defense treaty between our two countries, and I applaud its passage out of this committee. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention H.Res. 720, which calls on the International Olympic Committees to restore Jim Thorpe's Olympic records as they restored his medals in 1982. As you know, Jim Thorpe was the first Native American to win the Olympic gold medal for the United States. He attended the Carlisle Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and was a two-time All-American for the school's football team. The Carlisle Industrial School is now located on the grounds of the U.S. Army War College Barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. There is much to praise in these bills before us today, but I'm particularly grateful to be able to speak on the issue impacting hundreds of millions of girls and women worldwide, the evil, barbaric practice of female genital mutilation, or FGM. I thank Congresswoman Wild and Congressman Sensenbrenner for introducing House Res 723, a resolution encouraging all nations to end sexual violence against girls through data-driven reforms. This resolution explicitly encourages nations to implement multidisciplinary, evidence-based response plans to end sexual violence against girls. I am pleased to co-sponsor this legislation and join them in their efforts. The practice of FGM has affected nearly 200 million girls worldwide. 3 million girls are at risk every year, and most endure the procedure before they turn 15 years old. In many countries, a majority of girls who survive this horrific procedure are between 0 and 4 years of age. 91% of Egyptian women between the ages of 15 and 49 have undergone FGM. That figure is at 98% for women in that age range in Somalia, 89% in Mali, 88% in Sudan, 74% in Ethiopia, 96% in Guinea, and 88% in Sierra Leone. I am thankful to my colleagues for their advocacy on this issue, coupled with this committee's demonstrated commitment towards combating such human rights abuses as human trafficking. We are demonstrating an unmistakable fidelity to the cause of justice and peace. And I thank the committee, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I want to start by thanking Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for working with me to bring my bipartisan resolution, H.Res 723, to markup. I also want to thank my friend, Representative Lois Frankel, for her tireless work and support on this issue and all issues affecting women and children. Sometimes lost in this era of hyperpartisanship is the good work that Democrats and Republicans do in this Foreign Affairs Committee every day. Today's slate of 11 bills is a perfect example of the good that we can do when we work together. My resolution, endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics, CARE USA, UNICEF USA, and many others, recognizes that sexual violence against girls spares no culture, country, race, religion, or ethnicity. Globally, 50% of all sexual assaults are committed against girls who are under the age of 16. The lifelong impact that these assaults have on young girls cannot be understated. They decrease the number of years spent in school, they increase the rates of suicide, early high-risk pregnancies, and HIV/AIDS, and they perpetuate intergenerational poverty, hurting families, communities, entire countries, and our global economy. And worst of all, these assaults rob children of their youth and of their belief that there is good and decency in this world. But there is a path forward, one that is adaptable and considers the unique challenges legally and culturally that local communities face. Violence Against Children surveys, or VACs, were designed by the Centers for Disease Control. VACs are data-gathering household surveillance tools employed by 22 nations across the globe and have reached 60,000 individuals. In conjunction with INSPIRE, a program developed by the World Health Organization to help establish and enforce new laws and victim response and support services, these surveys guide reforms for each participating nation with great success. For example, in Kenya, Malawi, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, VACs resulted in a significant decrease in sexual violence against children and adolescents. My resolution applauds the leadership of those countries that have implemented data-driven, in-country, multi-sector reform to put an end to sexual violence against girls. It also urges all countries to put into place VAX and INSPIRE in keeping with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which included specific goals to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children, and to achieve gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. Through this resolution, we can help establish integrated systems that protect girls and create survivor advocacy centers that make mental health services more accessible worldwide. To victims of sexual violence, we see your struggle, we hear your cries for help, and we stand in solidarity with you all. I urge passage of this resolution out of committee, and I urge leadership to bring this to the floor of the House as quickly as possible. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank Mr. Connolly for introducing H.R. 2166 as a very timely piece of legislation. Right now, we're facing an international health crisis that is threatening economic stability and, more importantly, the lives of so many people around the world. My amendment urges the President to appoint an expert to lead the management of crises like this one, someone who is experienced in public health or crisis management, who can better help us navigate an outbreak like the coronavirus. The original intent of this bill was to explicitly direct the President to designate an employee of the NSC to coordinate interagency processes for responding to the global health security emergencies. However, part of being an effective member of Congress and this committee often means making very deliberate compromises. With that in mind, this committee worked together to amend the bill text to encourage rather than to direct. Regardless of the legal jargon, let me make it clear the urgency of this particular matter. By failing to mandate a permanent NSC position to manage pandemics, we are opening ourselves to the risk of yet another outbreak for which we will be woefully unprepared. Given that both Republicans and Democrats support this amendment, I expect the President to sign this legislation and to appoint a qualified person to the advisor position with haste. We simply cannot afford to wait for the next coronavirus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Okay, I thank the gentlewoman. I now recognize Mr. Malinowski. Give him 3 seconds to catch his breath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We have a number of good pieces of legislation here, which I'm very happy to support. I want to take my time to speak about one bill which I will support, but which I do find in some ways disappointing, and I want to just express some thoughts about it, and that is the resolution on our relationship with South Korea. I agree with what it says. I'm disappointed by what it does not say, and I think we need to be honest about that. Let me start by expressing what I think all of us pretty much agree on. We agree that South Korea is our ally. We agree that South Korea is worthy of being our ally. It is a democracy, a country that shares our values and our burdens in the world. We agree that North Korea is a horrific dictatorship, an adversary of the United States, and a threat to peace and security in Asia. I believe all of us agree that our military commitment to South Korea is something that serves America's national security interests. We're not just there to protect the South Koreans. We're there because South Korea offers us a platform to protect our interests in Asia, to protect our other allies, including Japan, and to counter the threat of a rising China, not to mention deterring aggression from North Korea. I think all of us understand that South Korea pays a significant share of this joint partnership. Recently, South Korea paid about 90% of the construction of Camp Humphreys, a major military base, 90% of $11 billion cost. South Korea spends 2.6% of its GDP on defense, more than most of our European allies. South Korea contributes about half of the costs of stationing U.S. military personnel in that
country, I think all of us understand it would cost us more money to bring those troops home than it does to keep them there. And yet, we have a president who does not agree with that consensus, who has repeatedly questioned why we have troops in South Korea in the first place, a president who treats this alliance with South Korea the way he treats so many of our other alliances with democratic countries around the world. He treats it as if it is a protection racket. He's repeatedly said and argued that we should not be there unless we are paid to be there. He treats our troops in South Korea as if they are mercenaries. Right now, as we are passing this resolution, expressing our support for this partnership, the President is demanding that the South Koreans pay us 4 times what they currently contribute to meeting the shared costs of this alliance, a 400% increase, a shakedown, after a year, 2019, in which North Korea shot off more than 24 missiles in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. I think all of us here, Republicans and Democrats, understand that this is crazy. This shakedown of an ally in the middle of an ongoing national security crisis on the Korean Peninsula is absolutely crazy. I'm confident that Secretary Pompeo believes it is crazy. I'm confident that Secretary of Defense Esper believes it is crazy, that our military leaders believe it is crazy. But we are not willing to say so in this resolution. For the sake of bipartisan comity, we are going to pass a resolution that contains, honestly, a bunch of platitudes about the importance of this relationship and of this partnership, but that does not express the concerns of the United States Congress, which I believed are shared on both sides of the aisle, that it is wrong in the middle of a crisis to be shaking down an ally, and we do not stand with that. And I think this is because our Republican colleagues, even though most of them would agree with most of what I've just said, do not want to get into an argument with the Mad King in the White House, and that disappoints me. I think it diminishes the importance of our committee, diminishes the value of this resolution and other similar resolutions that we may pass. So I will vote for it, but with a heavy heart, with great disappointment, and with the hope that in the future we are willing to be a little bit more edgy, that we are willing, even as we strive for bipartisan consensus, to do things that may require a vote from time to time and a little bit of disagreement. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Costa.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member. This committee's work this morning, I think, reflects the bipartisanship that we like to see as it relates to our nation's foreign policy. I'd like to speak on the part of the en bloc measures that we are considering on voting this morning on the specific issue, and that is the Food for Peace Act, and that's the support of House Resolution 742, which I've introduced. This has been a successful bipartisan program for decades. Since 1954, Food for Peace has provided life-saving food assistance for some of the world's most vulnerable people. And while it has already saved millions of lives, clearly there's more work that can and should be done. Tens of millions of children suffer from the effects of malnutrition, while natural disasters that we know of, civil strife and other crises, put food supplies at risk every year. And that doesn't begin to talk about the challenges of climate change, in which we know many places around the world that are on a subsistence diet are going to be further impacted as their ability to produce food in those regions because of the impact of climate change will diminish, sadly. I've introduced House Resolution 742 to mark these important achievements and call for continued appropriation and prioritization for Food for Peace. The resolution has strong bipartisan support, has support of a number of interested organizations and trade groups that reflect the breadth and width of our country, as well as other international organizations. The support should remind us that Food for Peace is not only an important reminder of the generosity of American people, the American farmer, but a critical aspect of our national national security policy. I mean, this is smart policy, and when we do these kinds of work, we build relationships in the most positive ways. I often say that food security, I think, translates into national security for our country. So our nutrition assistance to the world's most vulnerable people is not only the right thing to do, but it's clearly in our interest. And so therefore, I ask my colleagues to stand with me and affirm the importance of the Food for Peace program, support this measure, 742, and I yield back the balance of my time. And I'll find my voice somewhere.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Hearing no further requests for recognition, and without objection, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. Without objection, each measure is considered as read, and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. The question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended. If amended, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to. And without objection, each measure is ordered favorably reported as amended, and each amendment to each bill shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business today. I thank Ranking Member McCall and all of the committee members for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. Markup is adjourned.
It is not.